I never thought a name could break a family. But here I am, late at night in my son's nursery, listening to his monitor static while my husband sleeps on the couch. It began as a small, quirky issue, but now I'm wondering if our marriage is falling apart over 2 syllables. James and I had chosen Elijah as our son's name, a simple choice we both liked for its strong yet gentle sound, one that could suit a poet or a scientist. However, his grandmother Linda, when holding him for the first time at the hospital, looked at his wrinkled face and instead of using the name we picked, referred to him by a different name. I thought she must have misspoken, maybe still affected by the morphine from her hip surgery last year, but she continued to call him by that other name at every visit and in every message. When we asked her about it, she waved it off, insisting that it was a family name. James, unable to hide his doubts, later confessed that there was no one with that name in our family. It wasn't a cousin, a great-uncle, or anyone else. We tried to laugh it off as just one of those odd new grandma habits. Then the gifts started showing up. One day, there was a onesie with the disputed name stitched across the chest in blocky letters, and another time, a stuffed elephant arrived with a tag dedicated to him by that other name. James figured it was some kind of bulk order error from an unreliable online store, but the gifts were all exactly labeled. I even noticed an embroidered blanket at Elijah's 2-month checkup, one that had been mistakenly left in his diaper bag. When I brought it up, James just shrugged and said that Linda was old and I should let it go. I tried to dismiss it until a pediatrician's visit made everything unavoidable. Linda accompanied us, fussing over Elijah while I filled out forms. It wasn't until I saw the chart that I realized Linda had corrected the nurse by asserting that his name was actually the other one. Soon I discovered that the receptionist had typed it in as his legal name. Fixing it took 3 hours and required 2 notarized forms. That night, when James came home, he found me in tears over piles of paperwork. He claimed I was overreacting, insisting that it was just a nickname. But nicknames aren't meant to come with engraved silver rattles. Last Sunday at dinner, hosted by Linda, her unusually quiet behavior throughout the week should have been a warning. At dinner, she presented Elijah with an ornate rattler, a heavy, antique piece that must have cost nearly half our mortgage, and then announced that everyone was blessed because the family was finally united by that name. The shock made me stand up so abruptly that my chair squeaked, and I told her to leave. The tension split the room instantly. One of James' aunts muttered that I was being harsh, while a younger cousin rolled her eyes, remarking that this was typical behavior from Grandma. James sat silently, cutting his pork chop into ever smaller pieces. Finally, I lost my temper and threatened to leave with Elijah if I wasn't supported, and in a strained voice, James suggested that perhaps I should leave. Linda broke down, tears streaming down her face and smudging her eyeliner, as she reminded everyone of everything she had done for our family. James looked away, caught between his mother and me. Now James avoids the nursery and claims I forced him to choose sides. Later, I received a voicemail from Linda's sister, questioning whether I was really tearing the family apart over a name. I've reached the point where I'm not sure what to think. Yesterday, I found a letter in James's jacket pocket, its message scrawled in Linda's messy handwriting. It spoke about preserving what she believed was the proper heritage of our family and warned me not to let her erase who we were. On top of that, our joint account showed a $500 withdrawal labeled for family mediation. James tried to explain it away as money for a massage because he was stressed. This morning, Linda arrived with a wooden plaque marked as a frame for a birth certificate. Instead of the usual details, it displayed that other name prominently. In my rage, I slammed the door so hard that Elijah woke up crying loudly. James warned that if I didn't apologize, his family might even skip celebrating Elijah's first birthday. I sit here now, staring at the monitor and watching the soft green light flicker with each of Elijah's breaths. James' pillow still rests on the couch, and the blanket Linda made, with the other name stitched near where his little toes kick, is now folded among donations. Yet somewhere inside, I can't help but wonder if I missed something important. Why that name? Why this constant fight? A lawyer I consulted mentioned that grandparents' rights didn't come into play here unless there was abuse. However, when I mentioned the unexplained withdrawals and how James seemed to freeze whenever his mother cried, she paused and advised me to keep records. Elijah began crying once again, and while I held him, comforting him with the name we had chosen for him, the echo of Linda's voice, soft yet piercing, kept repeating that other name over and over. James has been distant for weeks now, and I barely recognize the bond we once had. Maybe I'm the one in the wrong. Maybe I should have simply accepted her nickname. But when I look at my son, my Elijah, I can't shake the fear that giving in would have been like pulling the first thread from a delicate sweater, now coming undone completely, and I'm not sure how to fix it. One thing is clear though, I won't let them rewrite who he is. Now for the first update. 3 weeks. That's how long it's been since I first posted here about my mother-in-law renaming our son. I thought things couldn't get any worse, but I was wrong. The package arrived on a Tuesday. Linda had been unusually quiet ever since I had slammed the door in her face, so when a box showed up with her loopy handwriting spelling out David's clothes, I almost didn't open it. James was in the kitchen making coffee, his back turned to me as if it were a wall. Inside were tiny sweaters, each with a D monogram on the collar. I remember holding one up, feeling the scratchy wool against my palm, and remarking that they should be donated. James didn't bother turning around. His only response was a stiff nod. Later, when I went to grab his gym bag for laundry, I discovered more neatly folded sweaters hidden beneath his sweatpants. The following day, his brother called. Mark's tone was superficially cheerful as he inquired about Elijah before mentioning with an edge that our mother was saying I was having episodes and keeping the baby away from her. I stood in the driveway, phone pressed to my ear, while a neighbor watered their lawn as if nothing was amiss. Mark added that she was scared and that I should know how she got. I wasn't really sure what to think, especially since James never talked much about his childhood beyond vague mentions of piano lessons and church potlucks. Then I found the life insurance policy. It was tucked away in the filing cabinet, buried under old tax returns. Apparently, James had updated it just last month. Under dependents, he had listed David with our last name, completely omitting Elijah. I stared at the document until the letters blurred in frustration. When I confronted him, he claimed it was just paperwork, insisting that the agent had simply made an error on the form. Yet his eyes wouldn't meet mine. He then went out for what he called a drive and didn't return until 3 a.m., reeking of gas station coffee and the same cologne he wore when we first met. Then the money disappeared. Another $1,000 was taken from our savings, this time marked as a loan repayment. I later found James sitting at the edge of our bed, his hands dangling between his knees, as he explained that his mother said he owed her for piano lessons, listing an amount of $20 per lesson from 1998 to 2003. When I asked for the total amount he'd borrowed, he simply rubbed his thumb over his wedding band and questioned if it really mattered. It did, because that same week, a certified letter arrived. Linda's lawyer used terms like emotional alienation and best interests of the child, invoking something called grandparents' rights, a concept I scarcely understood. James pleaded with me to settle the matter, suggesting that we simply allow her supervised visits and avoid a prolonged fight. His hands trembled as he made his case, but I refused, and ever since he hasn't spoken to me. Work has turned into a minefield. I ended up crying during a budget meeting, quiet tears slipping down my chin as my boss droned on about Q3 projections. Afterwards, she pulled me aside and suggested I take some leave, which I found laughable because we simply need the income. I later noticed that James's most recent paycheck had been cut by $500 under a deduction labeled family mediation. Then came the note found in the diaper bag, and it was the worst of all. It was written on cream-colored stationery, the kind Linda favored for her Christmas cards, and it simply instructed that I call her when I was ready to respect what she called David's roots. In a fit of anger, I tore the note into pieces, only to later retrieve the scraps from the trash and attempt to piece them back together, like a ransom note of sorts. Yesterday, James's childhood pastor called. His voice was slow and syrupy as he advised that my son needed both sides of his family. I couldn't help but picture Linda sitting in a pew, clutching her pearl necklace and playing the martyr. I ended the call abruptly while I was in the middle of a prayer. The lawyer I hired, using the last $800 of my personal savings, told me that Linda's case was weak because courts don't enforce nicknames unless the other parent corroborates the grandparent's claims. Her words echoed in my mind as I thought about the life insurance policy, the hidden clothes, and James's consistent silence. He discovered the legal papers last night. I had left them on the printer while they were still warm. His outburst was so explosive that it woke Elijah, who immediately began wailing. He then shouted that I was proving Linda right about me, and I even felt spit on my cheek, though I didn't bother wiping it off. He grabbed the car keys, stuffed Elijah's favorite stuffed frog into the diaper bag, and announced that they were leaving for his parents' house for one night. That was 36 hours ago. My lawyer warned me that if James sided with Linda, the court might question my mental stability. I haven't been able to sleep since, obsessively checking the nursery camera, which only reveals empty crib bars and the faint outline of that embroidered blanket peeking out from the donation pile. I'm not sure what hurts more, the way James looked at me when he left, as if I were a stranger, or the thought that Elijah's first word might end up being David. It only took 3 weeks for everything to unravel. Now I find myself sitting with a cold cup of coffee, listening to my lawyer's voicemail again, a message that begins with a caution about the lack of my husband's support. The words fade into static, and I can't tell if it's the phone line or just my racing thoughts. But I'm not willing to give in. No matter how this ends, my son's name will always be Elijah. Now for the second update. A month. That's how long it's been since James came back. He walked through the door holding Elijah, his face blank, as if he'd just returned from a grocery run instead of spending 3 days at his mother's. He didn't mention where he'd been. He simply handed me the diaper bag and mumbled something about Linda threatening to cut him out of the will if he sided against blood. I didn't ask what that meant because I was too busy counting Elijah's fingers, making sure he was still whole. After that, James started sleeping in the nursery because he claimed the couch hurt his back. At night, I would hear him shuffling around, the creak of the rocking chair and the soft click of his phone lighting up. Elijah began crying whenever James picked him up. It was a shrill, panicked sound that made my ribs ache. I tried not to read too much into it. So many books say that babies sense tension, but when your husband won't meet your eyes and your son screams in his arms, it's hard not to see a pattern. Then the subpoena arrived. Linda's lawyer demanded my therapy records from 2 years ago, back when I had struggled with postpartum anxiety. My attorney slammed her pen on the table as she explained that the records were irrelevant and that they were trying to paint me as unfit. I sat there staring at the legal jargon, wondering how a few months of tearful sessions about sleep deprivation and identity loss could be used as a weapon. James didn't ask about the subpoena. He simply began leaving for work earlier, coming home later, and always locking the nursery door behind him. The voicemail from his dad seemed to be a mistake. A drunk dial, maybe. His voice, slurred through my phone speaker, mentioned that Linda had always been fragile ever since the stillbirth 35 years ago, and insisted that she should keep whatever it was. I played it 4 times, my thumb hovering over the delete button. Then, despite feeling invasive, I Googled Linda, maiden name stillbirth. The local paper's archives offered a brief note reporting that David Michael, the infant son of Linda and Robert, had passed away in utero at 32 weeks, dating 5 years before James was born. That night I confronted him. He had been folding laundry, Elijah's tiny socks, methodically pairing them, when I asked why he had never told me. His hands froze, and then he crumpled right there on the carpet, sobbing into a onesie. His parents had buried the stillbirth like a shameful secret. There was no funeral, no marker, only a Bible verse about God's plan and an unspoken rule never to mention David's name. In a choked, broken voice, he explained that his mother had episodes during which she would obsess over buying toys and clothes, only to be forced by his dad to return them. I sat beside him, my knee brushing against his, and realized that was the first time he'd touched me in weeks. We agreed to counseling for just the 2 of us. Linda wasn't allowed, as the therapist refused to include third parties. James began showing up late and reeking of the peppermint gum he chewed when he was nervous. During one session, the counselor asked him to name one thing he needed from me. He stared at the floor before eventually admitting that he needed me to stop punishing his mom. I bit my tongue so hard I could almost taste blood. The hearing was even worse. Linda appeared in a navy suit, her hair curled in the style of a 1950s housewife, and testified that I was erasing David's memory. Her voice trembled as she clutched a tissue. The judge, a tired woman with a silver bob, kept massaging her temples. During recess, James pulled me aside and murmured his idea of letting Linda refer to him as David in private. His breath reminded me of the butterscotch candies his mom always carried in her purse. I walked out with my heels echoing in the empty courthouse. When the case was dismissed, I felt no relief. My lawyer had cited a precedent about nicknames and parental rights, but all I could hear was the sharp crack of the gavel and Linda's quick inhale. James drove us home in silence. That night, a wreath of white lilies, the kind you often see at funerals, arrived along with a card addressed for David, with a note about eternal love. I threw the card in the dumpster, though the smell lingered for days. James blocked Linda's number after she called 17 times between midnight and 3 a.m. He showed me his phone, the screen flooded with notifications, as if I needed proof of her persistence. Yet he hadn't blocked any of her friends. Later, while charging his old phone in the kitchen, I discovered a text from someone named Marjorie warning that if Linda were to crack, they would take Elijah. The timestamp matched the hour he had taken him to clear his head the previous week. His job began suffering. Missed deadlines and distracted work landed him on probation. He blamed me for his dwindling focus, snapping that he couldn't possibly concentrate with the war zone tearing through our home, before shoving past me toward the nursery. The next morning, I changed the locks, not because I feared he would steal Elijah, but because it was the one thing I could control. When he realized he couldn't get in, he called the police. They showed up on our porch, unimpressed, stating that it was still my house too. He ended up leaving with a duffel bag and Elijah's favorite stuffed frog. I later saw the nursery camera footage showing them at Linda's. In a brief frame, she held Elijah up as if he were a tiny lion cub, with a wide, unrestrained laugh that I could only imagine. I've rewatched that clip 43 times. My lawyer now says that filing for custody is the next step. I should feel relieved, yet I can't help but remember James's face when I told him I was pregnant, how he spun me around in the parking lot, both of us laughing, his hands so steady. Elijah's first birthday is next month. The relatives aren't coming, but I plan to bake a smash cake anyway, vanilla with blue frosting. I'll sing to him, just the two of us, and hope he doesn't start calling me daddy just yet. I keep the shredded note from Linda's stationery in a Ziploc bag, which is supposed to serve as evidence according to my lawyer. But really, it's a reminder. Trauma doesn't justify theft, and grief isn't a license to rewrite someone else's life. This morning, James texted asking if we could talk, but I haven't answered. The house is quieter without him, yet the air feels lighter, as if after a storm. I'm slowly learning the difference between being alone and being free. Elijah's name appears on the custody papers 14 times, and not once does it mention David. Now for the final update. A month. That's how long it's been since James came back. He walked through the door holding Elijah, his face blank, as if he'd just returned from a grocery run rather than spending 3 days at his mother's. He didn't mention where he'd been. He simply handed me the diaper bag while murmuring something about Linda threatening to cut him out of the will if he sided against family. I didn't ask what that meant because I was too busy counting Elijah's fingers, making sure he was still whole. After that, James started sleeping in the nursery because he claimed the couch hurt his back. At night, I would hear him shuffling around, the creak of the rocking chair and the soft click of his phone lighting up. Elijah began crying whenever James picked him up. It was a sharp, panicked sound that made my ribs ache. I tried not to read too much into it. So many books say that babies sense tension. But when your husband won't meet your eyes and your son screams in his arms, it's hard not to see a pattern. The custody hearing was worse than I'd imagined. Linda sat stiffly in her navy suit, her hair curled as if she'd stepped out of an old photograph. When the judge questioned the old psychiatric hold from the 90s, something about delusions tied to the stillbirth, James's head snapped up. He hadn't known about it. His mother had been hospitalized for weeks after the stillbirth, convinced that her son David was waiting for her. With trembling hands, James admitted under oath that Linda had referred to Elijah as David's second chance. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. All I could think about was how she'd sewn that blanket, stitching his name over and over, as if by sheer force the fabric of time could be bent. The judge attributed it to a failure to protect and granted me temporary sole custody. That same afternoon, James moved out. Not to an apartment, but to Linda's guest house. Later, my lawyer discovered that she had funded the lawsuit with his inheritance and that she had completely drained it. A week later, he showed up unshaven and holding a coffee cup like a peace offering. We sat on the porch steps while he explained everything about the forgeries, the life insurance documents, the withdrawal slips marked for family mediation. Apparently, Linda had even mimicked his handwriting, down to the sloppy initials. He explained that he had assumed she was merely overcome with sorrow, his attention fixed on a crack in the concrete. I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me wanted to hug him, while another part felt like hurling the coffee into the bushes. We tried counseling. The therapist asked him why he couldn't sever ties with his mother, and he kept insisting that, no matter what, she was still his mom. It was as if that one word explained everything. I remembered the voicemail from his dad, and the way his entire family carried their grief as if it were an heirloom they were bound to keep. Then, one day, Linda left a teddy bear on our porch, a stuffed animal with the name David stitched onto its paw. Later, the police arrived and took her away in handcuffs while Elijah napped upstairs. I remember clearly how James stood in the driveway, his face pale, as he heard her shouting that he was just like his father. That same night, James wrote her a letter with pen and paper, urging her to seek help and warning her that without it, she would never meet her grandson. In response, during a Sunday service, she got up and publicly accused him of being possessed. Afterward, his siblings began texting me, apologetic messages mostly, mixed with recounts of Linda's meltdowns over the years, including how she would buy boys' shoes in bulk, only to return them later, sobbing. They all admitted that they had played along with her behavior because it was easier that way. Last weekend, we dismantled the nursery entirely. While rummaging behind the dresser, James found the blanket embroidered with David's name. Without a word, he carried it outside and lit a match. I watched as the fabric curled into black ash, and for the first time I saw him cry without holding back. Elijah's birthday passed quietly. No cousins, no grandparents, just the three of us and a lopsided cake I had baked from a box mix. As James gave a small speech, our son ended up smearing frosting on his onesie. and his quiet affirmation of who he was felt like a vow. Then, yesterday, Linda's final note arrived with a brief message that essentially conceded defeat. I fed it to the shredder, watching as the machine turned the portion mentioning David into confetti. Moments later, James embraced me, a proper, heartfelt hug, not the stiff shoulder taps we had been accustomed to. I didn't allow myself to lean into the comfort, not just yet. Today, the custody papers arrived, 14 mentions of Elijah and none of David. James wants to try again, slowly. I'm not completely sure, but for now, the house smells faintly of burnt sugar from the cake, and the nursery walls are freshly painted in a soft green, reminiscent of new leaves. Maybe that's enough for now.